me start off by telling you very briefly how this diary reemerged after 61 years of obscurity. The Historical Society of Southern California was headquartered at the Lummis home, which is in, I don't know if it's Highland Park or Sycamore or whatever, but northeast of downtown Los Angeles. We were there for 50 years, and then because things were not working out with the city of Los Angeles, we vacated in January 2015, a little before Amy was hired, and we had a couple people given very short notice to box everything up and get it out of that house. And a decision was made to take some of it to the museum where I work temporarily to keep it in decent storage conditions. And other material that was considered less important was taken to public storage in Pasadena. So that's where the story started to take a different direction. I'd like to think this is like an Indiana Jones kind of thing where you're doing archaeological work, but it's not that glorious. It's public storage where she spent months going through stuff, and I showed up to help her out. But the goal was to find other historical material that maybe we didn't realize was there, or reassess it. And in doing that, I found a number of things. A death notice for Antonio Maria Lugo, a prominent member of the California elite of the 19th century. The original death notice was sitting by itself, not in an envelope, at the bottom of a box with files on top of it. How it got there, don't know. Old deeds, stuff like that. But the real find was this little pocket diary that was in a Historical Society of Southern California envelope where the zip code is 19. So you kind of get an idea how far back this is. And it said on the outside, Diary 1865, Charles M. Jenkins. And I know a little bit about that period, and I thought, oh, wait a minute, this is the one guy who fought for the Union Army from Los Angeles at a time when this was a Confederate stronghold. And so I knew that much, I just didn't know what was inside that. There were actually two pocketbooks. The one that's in here also in this little case is basically a notebook. Figures, facts, little things, nothing very exciting. But the diary was in there. And then tucked into the diary was another small envelope that had a letter in it. And the letter was folded up. It's actually in 4 pieces because the folds tore over time. And that became part of the story too. And I don't want to give too much away for the other speakers, but Charles Jenkins was in a unit from Massachusetts, a volunteer from California, was in the battlefield and was captured by the Confederates and sent to several camps, including the notorious Andersonville, if you've heard of that. One of the most remarkable places, and I say remarkable in a negative sense, of the war. The letter that he wrote to his mother, who's here in Los Angeles, was after he was released and sent to a parole camp in Maryland. And the parole camp was basically where you're let out to recover. Parole means different things to us now, but it was a recovery camp. And he's writing in there about, I made it, I survived 15 months, of hell, and the Rebs couldn't kill me, and I want to get square with the Rebs. That's why we have the title, that's what he wrote in this letter. And then he sends it back home, and he goes somewhere and he buys a pocketbook, and on January 1st, 1865, he begins to record his experiences through about the end of September, when he gets back to Los Angeles. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later, but that's where this all came about. So once the diary was located, I took it back and began to try to transcribe it. And you'll see how small it is when you come up and how small the lettering is. Some of it's in pencil, so I had to get a loop and then scan it very high DPI and blow it up and carefully construct this. And it was quite an experience. And then Mary Opnick, who's the editor of the Southern California Quarterly, and Mary's back there with Amy. Mary spent a lot of time also taking the poorly written field notes. The guy wasn't highly educated, which is not surprising, most people weren't. But it was a bit of a challenge trying to read it in its original form. So she put it into, I don't know, standard English, I guess we would say, so that it becomes more readable. And that's what's been published in the Southern California Quarterly. We have the first part now published. Part 2 is just about done, I think. And should be out when, do you think, Mary?
It's hot off the presses, the second part.
Oh, is it out now?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's done.
So the first part was the letter about being released from prison. That was in the spring issue, summer issue. And the fall issue, which just came out, has the first half of the diary up until May.
Right.
And what's from May to the end of through September is going to be coming out about November 1st.
Okay, that's what I meant. So the last part of the diary is November 1st. Okay. So yeah, so that's the short story of how the diary was located. And then I thought, well, we got to get in contact with, and Mary actually, I think, helped get in contact with Lewis, so we could let him know about this, and you can talk about what you felt, jaw dropped and stomach dropped or whatever it was. And then we wound up getting hold of Wayne Sherman too, because we know that Wayne had this amazing collection of Jenkins stuff, and that's how this roadshow was put together. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over now to Lewis to give us a biographical background of Charles Jenkins, and we'll go from there. Lewis?
Thanks.
All right, my adventures with Charles Jenkins really began on a very interesting note. I read a book, and the book was called Their Horses Climbed Trees. And this name Jenkins came up in the book. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And, you know, he was from Los Angeles. Well, I never heard of anyone from Los Angeles who fought in the Civil War. So turned out that there was an exhibit at the Lincoln Shrine in Redlands. And one of our social studies teachers said, you know, I ought to go see it. So I go to Redlands, and, you know, there's Jenkins's pictures all over the place. And so I asked the Redlands people, you know, who can I get in touch with? And they put me in touch with the man who set the thing up, and his name was Mike Sorensen. I called Mike, and Mike said, no, I don't own the pictures. You have to talk to a man by the name of Wayne Sherman. You know, wasn't General Sherman? Yeah. So, Mike invited me to get together that they were having, and Wayne was there. I got to talk to Wayne, and you know, one thing led to another. So, you know, the rest is history, so to speak. But anyway, Charles Myers Jenkins. Shakespeare wrote all the worlds of the stage, and all men and women merely players. They had their entrances, they had their exits. In one man's time, he plays many parts, and this is very true of Charles Jenkins. He played many parts. Jenkins was born in Circleville, Ohio, June 2nd, 1839. Second son of Richard and Elizabeth Jenkins. The Jenkins were apparently pretty well off there in Circleville. However, Richard, Dick Jenkins as he was called, passed away, and really Charles never got to know his father because Richard passed away when Charles was 3 years old. Elizabeth remarried. Elizabeth also had, the Jenkins also had a daughter, Caroline, and a second son, W.W. as he's known as. Okay. Elizabeth remarried, being married to George Dalton. George Dalton's name may sound familiar too, at least the name Dalton may sound familiar, because his brother, Henry Dalton, owned most of San Gabriel Valley. Don Enrique, as he was called. But anyway, Charlie grew up in the San Gabriel Valley, learned how to be a cowboy, learned Spanish, because the vaqueros obviously spoke Spanish, and really, he really adopted the California culture. He learned Spanish, got baptized Catholic, grew up in the Los Angeles area. He's kind of an interesting character, very restless young man apparently. Spent some time in the San Bernardino Mountains prospecting, which is something we'll probably get to a little later on. And at one time worked for the Los Angeles Star. Well, if you know anything about the Los Angeles Star, it was very much a pro-secessionist paper. Okay. Henry Hamilton, who owned the Star, wrote some pretty inflammatory articles about the Civil War and where Los Angeles, where California should be in the Civil War. I'll read part of this to you. This was an editorial taken out of the Los Angeles Star, May 4th, 1861. Fraternal bloodshed flowing in living streams, cities torched, homes laid waste, fields covered with the dead and the dying. Such are the pictures which rise in view and contemplation of active warfare. And this deplorable condition has our glorious country been reduced. And why? Because the North would not cease to interfere in the affairs of the people with which they have no rightful concern. So that gives you an idea where he's coming from. Mr. Hamilton spent some time behind bars because of these views, you know. Anyway, Jenkins once worked for him. His pension papers claimed that he claimed in his pension papers that he was a typesetter. If you look at the diary and you look at the spelling, I don't think he was a typesetter. He probably was more or less a printer, which means he's the guy that got to rub the ink over the type. Well, anyway, for whatever the reason, and this is something of a mystery because he could have enlisted at drum barracks and had gone off to fight the Civil War in New Mexico or Arizona, but he chose instead to go north to San Francisco and enlist with the Union Army there. Massachusetts basically was running out of recruits. The war had gone on, this is 1863, the war had gone on for 2 years now, 2 years plus, and Massachusetts couldn't fill its quotas. So there were some men from Massachusetts living in San Francisco, and they contacted the governor of Massachusetts saying, hey, we'll send Californians over. Okay, so Charles goes up there, he enlists in what is known as the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry, which is interesting because those people were all from California. They go across the Isthmus of Panama. Basically, what Charles is doing is retracing the same steps that he and his family took when they came to California in 1850, except in reverse. Reports to New York. They spend a few days in New York. And they are camped in front of City Hall in New York. It's kind of interesting. They also attend a play on Broadway, not Broadway, I'm sorry, play on the Bowery in New York, which of course is kind of interesting, being a former drama teacher. Next thing they knew, they were sent off to Massachusetts for basic training. And then they went south. And their main antagonist was a man which was known as the Gray Ghost. Anyone know who that guy was? John Mosby. Mosby was a guerrilla fighter in Northern Virginia, and he was, he was involved with the Confederates and great hero there in Northern Virginia. Well, anyway, that was Charles' main antagonist. On bringing forces from Washington to the Union forces in Northern Virginia, Charles and company stopped at a place called Gooding's Tavern. Gooding's Tavern is east of Fairfax, and Charles was no doubt in talking to the women, and that's going to become clear, I think, when Paul reads some excerpts from the diary. He was quite the ladies' man, really. At least his diary claims he's quite the ladies' man. I compared him to Romeo, better compare him to Casanova than Romeo, if you believe everything he's written in his diary. Well, anyway, skirmish breaks out. Mosby is shot out of the saddle and presumed dead by Union forces because they don't hear from him in 6 months. Well, anyway, Charles and other members of his detachment are captured, and then starts his journey to the prisoner of war camps. First, courage, Charlie. I think we had that going there. Well,
Yeah,
okay.
let's go down to.
Okay, all right, here's the New Bowery Theater where they saw the play. Below that is the grounds of New York City Hall. And here we go to prison camps. Okay. Oh, Gooding's Tavern. A little story about that. When I began writing the article, I contacted Fairfax Library, hoping that somebody there would have some information about Gooding's Tavern. And this was about 10 years ago. And no one had much information about it at the time. In fact, they didn't even know what Gooding's Tavern was at the time. But anyway, they began looking into this. And so when I went to Fairfax, just a couple of years back, I asked the librarian there, do you have anybody who knows anything about Gooding's Tavern? And they tell me, yes, there's a lady who knows a lot about Gooding's Tavern, but she moved to San Francisco. Here I am. Like,
Where's Fairfax?
Yeah.
You mean Fairfax, Virginia, or Fairfax in Los
Fairfax, Virginia.
Okay.
So here I am. I'm in Virginia. She's in California. I mean, we got this switched around. Okay. So anyway, she did keep her telephone number, her Virginia telephone number, on her cell phone. So the folks at the library called her up for me, and I got a chance to talk to her. And she thanked me for finding out something about Gooding's Tavern. And what happened was that they got really interested in this, and the county of Fairfax and the state of Virginia put up a historic marker where the tavern used to be. Little River Road, east of Fairfax, Virginia. And that's the marker that you see up there. All right, getting back to the Jenkins story. Charles went to Libby Prison first. Libby Prison was actually a warehouse. Libby was a grocer there in Richmond, but it was converted into a prison. Later on, he would be removed from Libby because that was taken over by Union officers. Well, I mean, that's where the prison for Union officers. And then he moved to Belle Island. This is a very interesting picture of Belle Island there. It's in the middle of the James River. Right now, there is a freeway bridge that crosses the island. Actually, it's built above the island. And interestingly enough, it's the Robert E. Lee Bridge. Now, well, anyway, this was not a good place, but it even got worse. He was then transferred to Andersonville. Wayne will talk, I'm sure we'll talk about Andersonville when he comes out here. While he was at Libby, here's the picture of Andersonville. There aren't too many pictures of Andersonville. This happened to be one. It's not the greatest quality, but it was the best I could come up with. So there it is. You notice there are no structures there. It's tents, holes in the ground, that sort of thing. Going back to Libby for just a minute. At Libby Prison, no doubt he made the acquaintance of a very large dog, a guard dog, a dog by the name of Hero. And this dog was enormous. Give you some idea. There we go. He was 198 pounds. He ate 6 to 7 pounds of raw meat a day. And he was something of a celebrity there in Richmond. He wandered the streets, and you know, when you're a dog that big, nobody's going to bother you. Okay? Wandered the streets. Eventually, he was turned over to the Confederate Army to be a guard dog. He also was in a play there in Richmond before he became a guard dog. It's kind of interesting. The guy was on stage. Okay. So anyway, Charles no doubt had some acquaintance with the dog because there was a picture of the dog that hung in his house. Can you believe that? Wayne and I decided it must have been Stockholm Syndrome. That had to be. Okay. Well, anyway, Charles has moved from Andersonville to Milan, another prison there in Georgia. He's there a very short time. Ironically enough, Milan Prison is in Jenkins County. Anyway, Charles is actually released, goes to Annapolis, as Bob was telling you. It was kind of a place to go where you get back into the swing of things. Begins writing his diary, which we'll talk about more later. And then the war ends. And he goes back to Los Angeles. It takes him a while to get back there, but he goes back to LA. Again, you know, most of my research is based on his pension papers. And the pension papers, you've got to take with a grain of salt because he's saying all kinds of things in the pension papers that you really begin to question, especially after you read the excerpts from the diary. I mean, he sounded like, I was living in Libby, when you've gone through Andersonville, and Wayne's got some pictures of what these people looked like after they left Andersonville. I mean, that is a traumatic experience. He had all kinds of ailments. He was suffering these ailments the rest of his life. And the older he got, the worse the ailments got. You really wonder if he was that bad shape when he came back to Los Angeles. I mean, one of his friends said that he looked like a walking skeleton, which could be, but he doesn't mention it in the diary at all. Anyway, the rest of the 1860s, basically he's recovering from his traumas in Andersonville and other places. He marries a woman by the name of Libby. They live in a small house on what was known as Jenkins Avenue in Los Angeles, south of downtown. Jenkins Avenue is now 24th Street. But in the old maps, it shows it as Jenkins Avenue. And he would live in that house for some time. They had a child, and the child died of childbirth. They would adopt, later on, they would adopt an orphan, Gabriella, and they would eventually move to a house on Santee and 12th Street, a little further up north from where they were. He got a job at the water company, and of course his brother, I'm sure he'll be explaining to you, worked with the water company once upon a time too. And he worked his way up to be superintendent. It was the highest paying job in Los Angeles at the time, because there's one thing Los Angeles needed a lot of, and that was water. Because basically Los Angeles, Southern California, is desert. When the Republicans took over the city government, he lost his job, and he was very bitter about this. He was a Democrat. His father had been a Democrat. His father ran a Democrat newspaper back in Circleville, Ohio. He had remained a Democrat even though he fought in the Civil War, and he lost his job. And really bitter things he said about the Republicans in his pension papers. Well, anyway, because he knows Spanish, he gets a job as a translator for Federal District Court in LA. He and Judge Erskine Ross, I'm sure, must have gotten along very well because both of them had very sour personalities. 1894, we have the Pullman strike. By this time, Charles is a deputy U.S. Marshal. He is sent to La Grande Station, which was a Santa Fe station in town at the time, to guard the station. He also, and I'm not quite sure how he did this, He got a locomotive and a train to go out to Barstow and rescue some passengers that were stuck out in the desert and brought them back in. Because when the strike hit and Pullman attached mail cars to passenger cars, the American Railway Union would not move the cars, because that would bring Grover Cleveland to send the army in. Okay, which was part of their strategy. After the strike, he decides to retire from the federal government, and he does become a bailiff in Illinois Superior Court. He gets involved in all kinds of different things. He sells real estate. He goes with his brother into mining, which I'm sure you're going to talk about. And he and his wife are not getting along too well. She accuses him of desertion because he's off in Santa Clarita doing mining. But I really think it is, they separated. They never got officially divorced. They separated. I think it's had more to do with his personality than anything else. I mean, you can just put up with that for so long, and you can't put up with it anymore. A very telling quote from Catherine Mulholland's book on her grandfather, William Mulholland. A quote attributed to Charles Jenkins. He, when he was working for the water company, he threatened one of his employees. He told him, "I will cut your heart out." And that just kind of exemplifies maybe the type of person Jenkins was. He ran the water company as if he was in command of the 2nd Massachusetts, basically. Well, anyway, they part. They do not live together anymore. Gabriella goes off with her mother, and Charles is left basically alone. He outlives everybody. He outlives his brother. He outlives his daughter. He outlives his wife. He outlives all members of the Jenkins family. And he also, I have to put that up there. He also was a member of the Southern California Historical Society, who are the folks who are co-sponsoring this gathering. But there he is. He's the first man on what would be your left. Well, anyway, Charles lived until 1933. Passed his way in his home, Tennessee. He has somebody working for him, I think by the name of Juanita. Juanita, what's her last name again? Do you remember her last name? I got it here. What is that?
Oliveira.
That's it. Juanita Oliveira. And she inherits Jenkins. She inherits everything. Because all his family is gone. She's kind of a curious character, kind of a mystical character that comes in and out of the picture here. Well, anyway, Jenkins is buried at Evergreen Cemetery, Boyle Heights, and the Grand Army of the Republic erected this monument to Jenkins on his grave. Interestingly enough, right behind this monument, you can't see it, but right behind that is a small stone in the ground where his wife is buried. Okay, well, thank you very much for listening. I hope you learned something about Charles Jenkins.
Thanks, Louis, for the discussion of Charles's life. So I already went over some of this material in my introduction. Should have saved it, I guess. But there's a picture of the outside of the diary, and again, the discovery in storage in Pasadena just about a year ago. This is part of the parole camp letter. It has a neat vignette of the actual camp, which is one of the cool things about this, much less the content, so you can get an idea. It's probably a sanitized version. These things tended to make things look better than they really are. But part of the letter there, and again, Jenkins writing to his dear mother, Mama, that he's arrived just the day before from camp, suffering everything, or I guess anything, but death. Being thankful to be alive and all that. And talking, as I said before at the end, about getting square with the Rebs. The donor was Clement Gagliano, and Wayne can talk to you about who Clement Gagliano was and kind of the contortions of how Jenkins' stuff wound up to where Wayne has some of that stuff now, and then the diary happened to be with the Historical Society. It was donated by Gagliano in 1954. It was actually recorded in the Southern California Quarterly. In those days, in the back, they used to list the gifts to the organization, and it just said, gift of so-and-so, and I think it's a Charles Jenkins memorabilia or something along those lines. It didn't say Civil War diary or anything like that. But then it was probably put in a box and they're sat for over 60 years. All right, so what we did first, or what I did first after I transcribed it, and sometimes this is a scan where I actually played with the resolution and all that to get it more reasonable in terms of viewing, is once I transcribed it, I approached Amy and the Historical Society about doing some blog posts on the Homestead Museum blog, because the HSSC didn't have a blog. They had a Facebook page, and Amy's part-time, does full-time work. And so we thought, well, we can get this stuff out there if we did kind of a relationship between the HSSC and the Homestead Museum to do this. So there were a series of, I think, about 10 blog posts that summarized segments of the diary, gave some examples, quotes, and had some photos of some of the pages. And then that led to a discussion about having a two-part transcription for the Southern California Quarterly. And again, as I said, we've been doing presentations, and we'll be doing those through November.
How long did it take you to translate it or transcribe it?
It probably seemed a lot shorter than it really was, because anybody who does this kind of thing, when you're really into what you're doing, time flies, you feel like, but then you realize later on, wait a minute, it took me, I didn't eat for 3 days, whatever it was, that's involved in that. I'd say probably 3 weeks, a couple hours here, a couple hours there to do that. Yeah. This was easy, actually, some of this stuff. The pen was not too bad. It was a pencil, that got to be a little tough. And they had to, as you may know, they really had to use their space carefully, because it was, for a soldier, this is probably a bit of an expense. And then he didn't want to waste his space. I transcribed a diary of a guy who went from the New Orleans to San Francisco in 1851, the same route basically that was talked about before, through the Isthmus and all that. The guy ran out of paper at Baja. Didn't finish his journey, didn't conserve his space. He would write on the margins and everywhere you could to do that. So that was a little frustrating. You're doing a diary, what? He stops in the middle of nowhere? So yeah, but the idea was and that makes it a little tougher for the transcription, because you gotta work with something that is compressed in space. Okay, so what I found to be really some of the more notable elements about this was the everyday experiences of a soldier whose life is very mundane. We tend to glorify what soldiers do in war, and there's reasons for that that makes sense. It's part of the national narrative that you do and all of that. But the reality is that the vast majority of time for these guys is excruciatingly painful. Probably not as bad as being on a ship in the middle of the ocean where you're recording latitude, longitude, blah, 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 8 again, didn't like it. That kind of stuff. But really a lot of this was about the regimentation of life and how they shape dealing with that, the routine, dealing with officers that you didn't like because they ordered you to do something and then you do it and they tell you to go back and do it again, that kind of thing. There's a lot of that there. But there are some really interesting things too. For example, there was a point when his unit was marching down through Virginia, and they got to a little town called Staunton. And in Staunton in 1865, he said, "We stole fowl from old Mrs. Wilson." Now, some of you might know that we had a president, Woodrow Wilson, who was born in Staunton, Virginia in 1856. I just wonder if that was mom or a grandma or something. It's just little things like that are kind of fun. Or when he just casually refers to a fight between Custer and Gibbs, because George Armstrong Custer was there and had a pretty big role was going on at the last days of the war. And he kind of tosses that out. Or he says in his diary, of course he knows, he doesn't believe it, he's going to read this later on, but here we are now, prying into his personal life. So, sorry ladies. But it was a thing where he says, well, I didn't make the best use of my leisure time today, for I read The Lustful Turk. Anybody heard of The Lustful Turk?
No.
All right, here we go. A semi-pornographic novel published in England in the late 1820s that somehow made its rounds through the camp wherever he was at in Virginia. And it was a pretty crazy story. But the idea that just those little things, or as Lewis was referring to, he has a number of correspondents, mostly it appears young women. And there's Annie, and there's so-and-so, and there's so-and-so, and he falls in love with one, and then something happens, and it's broken off, and he sometimes gets in a very dark place. Now, a lot of people do this. We were talking about every family has got people who have these kinds of issues. They're just not usually public, talked about in a library. But the idea of that kind of thing is he's with a lot of guys, and it's months and months and months out on the road, very hard conditions. This is January 1, through the summer when he's finally discharged. So it's winter and there's snow and the food's not good. He's got stomach problems, probably because of his treatment at Andersonville, and you just get a lot of those kinds of indications going on. Once in a while, he talks about correspondence back and forth with people in California, maybe sending a newspaper or getting a letter, that kind of thing. At one point, he was asked to write a chart of the people in his unit, the men in his unit, how many had died, how many had been discharged, how many had been transferred, how many had gone AWOL, that sort of thing. So that was actually in the back of the diary, in a non-diary section. He had this chart of figures about that, which I thought was interesting. Another really cool thing in my mind is that he had souvenirs that were in there. Mary and I were talking about this a little bit, when he talks about I think it was a rose from Washington's tomb that somebody had given him. He'd been given a piece of the iron fence, which didn't go in the diary, it just probably disappeared somewhere. Little details like that. When he gets discharged and he's sent back to Reedville, Massachusetts, which is southwest of Boston, it's really interesting reading about what he is thinking as he's trying to interact with civilian people. For example, it's horrific, and he can't really talk about it in much detail because of the limits here. But evidently, a young woman had been taken by some soldiers, raped, and killed. And then right after that, he talks about trying to meet young women and talking about the fact that civilian girls don't like to interact with soldiers. Well, he talked about why that was. And that was a thing that he happened to notice very quickly. Then he had one of his correspondents who lived out in Springfield, Mass, further west, and he went out to visit her. And he had these high expectations. This is one thing you see in the diary. He's got this feeling he's gonna find the right woman for him, and then something always goes wrong. And that's probably the story of his life that way. It was always like that. But he goes to Springfield, and he meets this young woman, and he thinks something's gonna happen, and then he writes down in the diary, I don't have a place in her heart. And then a Mr. Smith shows up, who evidently maybe has a place in her heart, and Jenkins decides, I gotta get out of here. He even writes in the diary, he says, what did he say? It's either I leave or there's pistols involved. There's going to be a duel. If you know anything about 19th century America violence and men, especially his part of Ohio, it's in the north, but he's got a bit of a southern mentality. That sense of honor is very strong in a lot of males. And that's true in Los Angeles too, as we'll talk about with his brother in a minute. But yeah, he goes through that. When he gets back to Reedville and he's finally discharged, he has to go to New York. And he mentions going to a brand new park, Central Park. And just basically opened, I think, 3 years prior to his visit there. And he talks about it's pretty nice, but he says New York's a dull town, which I thought was really interesting. Dull? I don't know how that could be. He had a better time in Washington, D.C., though, prior to that. And Jenkins did what a lot of people do in their diaries, a lot of men do, is when he writes about amorous things, he will find ways to try to camouflage it. So in this case, because as you said, Louis, he was fluent in Spanish, he says, in one day, he says, I awoke this morning in La Casa de Montes. You know what La Casa de Montes is?
House of Love.
House of Lovers. Well, what is a House of Lovers, ladies and gentlemen? Right? So, again, it's a soldier, it's the end of the war, he's got a little money to spend, that kind of thing. When he leaves New York and he takes a steamer, he's going to go down to the Isthmus of Panama, cross over, and then take another steamer up the coast. And on the way down from the East Coast, he meets a young woman on the ship, and I think it's just Kate. There was never her last name, Kate G. And they have a little shipboard romance. They sleep together on the deck, but inevitably there's problems too. And they start to quarrel, and I think she told him to go to hell, and he said, I wish I had gone there. But then she presents him a gift of some shoes, and he says, I didn't like them. So I returned them. So I think that's part of the personality thing with him. Sometimes he just didn't get it. It's not about the shoes, okay? It's about the gift, that kind of thing. But then they get back together, and even when he gets to San Francisco, and they disembark, and he goes on to meet other women that he hopes he can strike up a romance with, he goes back to Kate. And he writes these little symbols, and it took me a while to figure this out because, I don't know, I'm not really good with cryptograms. But it's like he does a drawing with two vertical lines and a line in the middle. Well, that was a bet, I think. He's got an I, and he's got numbers. I think 12H was, I spent 12 hours with Kate. Stuff like that. He's got to do it in a crypto format, which is really interesting. But and this is probably not unusual. I'm sure there were a lot of soldiers who had those kinds of experiences. Most of them didn't write it down. Most of them If they didn't have their diaries survive. If they did survive, they didn't wind up in a historical society collection. If they did, they wouldn't wind up being talked about in public that much. But yeah, those are some of the things I found to be intriguing. He mentions the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Doesn't really express a lot of emotion about it. I get the feeling he's kind of in the middle somewhere. I don't see a lot of patriotism. I don't know if you guys felt that, at least in the diary part of it. He does talk about black people and in derogatory fashion. When they were coming down from San Francisco, there was a fire aboard the ship, and he said the were running around like crazy. I didn't get any sense from his writing that there was any real empathy, but I'm not surprised by that because, again, it's mid-19th century America, and even in the Union Army, I think there were other reasons you would fight, not because you thought blacks were human beings or equal with you, but because you didn't want to see the Union separated, or whatever it was that was going on. And I wouldn't judge someone too harshly based on that. Obviously, it's a viewpoint that has changed considerably, but it's the idea that a soldier is expressing himself in private in a way that he may or may not do in a public sense. So yeah, so those were some of the things that I thought was quite interesting. When they were trying to get mustered out, this always happens with a lot of these types of situations, is you're told, all right, next week we'll probably let you guys go. And then next week comes and they don't let you go. There's always some reason. And you hear about this sometimes as a historian or a history buff about what happens when soldiers have expectations of getting mustered out and it doesn't happen. Things can go really bad. And he mentions one, even when they're mustered out, they're so excited about being let go that the party erupts and things go haywire. And there was one where another company got mustered out, and he said several people were killed. There was the gunfire and the rioting and all that. But then the ominous threat: if we don't get mustered out, something bad is going to happen. That's basically what he says a couple of times in the course of the diary. This is basically the end of the experience here, and it's really interesting how he does this. Is that he gets back to LA, and it's let's see, where is it here? Yeah. It's right about this part of the diary, September 21, 22, 23. Gets back home, he meets his brother, he sees his mother who had some health problems, and then he talks about going out and buying a piece of property called the Habaneria, which is a soap making factory area, Rancho San Antonio, basically in the Downey, Bell Gardens area. And then September 24th, he just stops. That was basically the end. He did do 2 more entries in December, and then that was just sort of a little tangential thing. It's almost like he had gone through this amazing experience, had probably processed it to the extent that he could, and then there was no reason to continue on. What do you do when you're back home after all that? What are you going to write about? It's just back to normal, whatever that happens to mean to a person. A couple other things I'll mention here is some of the memorandum pages. These have their own little stories sometimes too. On the bottom in the center, this says, from the grave of William E. Ormsby of Company E, who was shot by court-martial. And he talked about that in the diary a little bit, about this guy who was killed. On the bottom, it says, a pink from Central Park. I think a pink rose or some kind of a flower. He did that in a number of areas. That's what I was telling you about before on the left, the list of deserters of the company. And he's got the ones from California, the ones from Massachusetts. This is the whole, actually it's the whole regiment. And then he's got the companies in the middle of that. So all kinds of interesting things that he did in this. On the right, a forget-me-not presented to me by so-and-so. And so this is the kind of thing you do find in diaries. It's almost like a scrapbook in some cases. Okay, so I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and turn this over to Wayne Sherman, and Wayne can tell you about his experiences dealing with this amazing stuff that he has to do.
Paul. First off, I want to thank the Santa Clarita Valley Historical Society for having us here today, and also the Historical Society of Southern California for promoting this. I've been chasing Mr. Jenkins for about 20 years now. I first learned of Mr. Jenkins in about 1996, and for many years after that, I searched for more things, as much information on him as I could, and it became a bit of an obsession, maybe. At one point, I actually even had a Grand Army uniform made and went around to various roundtables and gave a presentation in the first person as Mr. Jenkins. I'm not able to do that right now because it'd probably take a cannon to shoot me into that old uniform. But I was quite obsessed with him. Anyway, I'm the vice president of the Drum Barracks Garrison and Society, and that's the support group for the Drum Barracks Museum in Wilmington, California. I'm also a corporal in the 2nd Mass Volunteer Cavalry Reenactment Group, Civil War reenactor. We reenact the same outfit, only Charles was in Company E, we reenact Company A. You've heard of Civil War reenactors, maybe some of you have been to see some of those things. Another name is a TBG. You ever heard of a TBG? It's another name for reenactor, stands for Tubby Bearded Guy.
Where do you do those?
Fort Tejon is where we used to. Tejon only does maybe one reenactment a year now, so Moore Park, Fresno, there's less and less every year. It seems to be fading. It was in its heyday in the late 90s and early 2000s, but now everybody's getting so much older, and many of the younger kids are getting into World War II reenacting because that's so long ago. I'm also a charter member of the West Coast Civil War Collectors and a member of the Company of Military Historians, and I have been a collector for quite some time. I grew up in a town in Pennsylvania that many of the streets are named for Civil War generals. The local high school is called GAR High School, the Grand Army of the Republic. And my mom would drop me off at the YMCA every Saturday, and I would have to make my own way back home down Main Street. One of the places I would pass was the old GAR Hall on Main Street, which was a very red stone castle-like building with a huge naval tar standing out front at the ready with his cutlass, and then next to him would be a large Civil War soldier in a great coat leaning on his musket at the ready. And I'd have to pause every day and look at these. They just filled me with awe. Many years went by and I completely forgot about my interest in the Civil War, and then that Ken Burns documentary came out, if you remember. That was 1989, 1990. And that really got me going again. I became kind of a Civil War armchair historian at that point and did a lot more reading on it. And eventually took a trip to Virginia and traveled to all the various battlefields in Virginia, Pennsylvania. And on the way back, I was at the airport trying to think of what else I could do before we left. And there hanging on the wall was a bunch of relics and things. So I bought a box of relics before I came back. And that's where all the trouble started. That's when I became a collector at that point. I made the mental decision, I am going to collect this stuff, Civil War items. So I went to a Civil War reenactment at the time. I was not yet a reenactor. I met a man named Earl Robinson there, who was a dealer of Civil War artifacts. I bought a sword from him and was content to play with that for about the next half year, looking at it, thinking about it, staring at it. And by the next time Earl came to town for another show, I went to visit him half a year later or so and told him that I had made up my mind what I was going to do. I was going to collect Civil War California items because nobody's done that. Pennsylvania's been collected, everybody's got a specialty, but at that time, nobody was really collecting or paying attention to Civil War California. So Earl says to me, he says, you know what, Wayne? I saw a collection of California items at an antique store, and it's up north. It's in this little place called Solvang. Of course, I about fall over because that's where I live, in California. And he directed me to the antique store. So I went up there post haste, walked in the antique store, met Mrs. Keck, the little old lady that ran the place. She couldn't get around too well, but she'd sit at the front of the store leaning on her cane and just moving the eyes as people walked around the store to keep an eye on everyone. And for about the next several months, I would come back and forth and look at the items and ask her about her price, which was a pretty hefty price on it. And no, she wasn't going to split any of the items up. You had to buy the whole thing or nothing. So for several months, I went back and forth with her about this. And finally the day came, I had decided that, okay, we're going to make a deal. I'm going to march in there with a pocket full of cash, and she and I are going to make this deal. So I marched into her store, and I told her, I'm here to buy that collection, and you and I are going to work out a price, and I am leaving with it before something happens. And she says, oh, Wayne, I am so sorry. I sold it. She goes, the other day there was somebody waiting outside the shop for me, and he was after it, and yeah, he wanted the whole thing, you know. I said, I hope you charge the top dollars. Yes, I did, but I had to sell it, and I feel real bad about that. So she kind of gave me a consolation prize. He had some lithographic Grand Army cards or something, handed those to me, get me out of the store. And I left, I went back to my house pretty dejected. And one of my helpers at the time, I ran a construction business, one of my helpers was there doing some work at the house with me. He said, did you get it? I said, no, I messed around too long and I missed it. The phone rings, it's my wife on the phone, and she says she left the briefcase in the car in the garage. I go to the car in the garage, I open up the back door, and there's the collection sitting on the seat. She was sick of hearing me talk about it. Totally sick. She was gonna get that rock the collection for me. And at that time, I really didn't know what it was yet either, but I knew there were some very, very important things in it. The Andersonville Survivor Certificate. You'll maybe see one or two others if you look high and low. It's a very rare item. A photograph of a cavalryman outside on a CDV standing next to his horse. Extremely rare view. She said she had people coming through there every day offering her $800, $900 for that single image alone. Okay? So I knew it was an important collection. It had something to do with California. I wasn't sure. And as I did my research, I found out about the California 100 and the California Battalion. 500 men from California who paid their own way back east in order to participate in the Civil War. These men became part of the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry, companies A, E, L, F, and M for the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry. The first 100 went back. They were known as the California 100. And when they got there, the people of Boston realized that these men were more than the normal recruits from Boston. I mean, they knew which end of the horse you were supposed to feed. They knew where to put the bullets in the gun and things like that. So they asked, do you have any more like that out there? And that's when the telegraph went off across the country, and they raised 4 more companies in San Francisco to come around. That would be companies E, L, F, and M. Charlie was a member of Company E. The first photograph on the table here is Major Thompson, who was the man who organized those 4 companies. Okay, so as I did more and more research, I started looking into this Charles Jenkins character, and I realized there's nobody else from LA that went back and actually fought in the Army of the Potomac. There were other men that joined the 4th California Infantry or the 6th California Infantry and maybe marched off with the column here or there, but none of them had ever met or fought with rebels. So he would be the only person. And the first mention I saw of that was in Horace Bell's book, Reminiscences of a Ranger. And in that book, he mentions only Charles Jenkins and myself were the only men from Los Angeles to go and fight in the Civil War. Well, if you know anything about Horace Bell, you know he's full of hooey. Okay? And he was gone well before the Civil War. He had used his boisterous mouth to get himself into fight after fight. He got the petunias knocked out of him, and he had to leave town. So when the war broke out, he was actually in Indiana, and he joined the 6th Indiana Infantry. He was not in LA at the time, which truly makes Charles Jenkins the only man from Los Angeles that traveled east that fought in the Civil War. After the war, of course, Horace came back and he started his famous paper, The Porcupine. And just by the name, you could kind of tell what some of the articles were like in The Porcupine. So at that point, I realized who Jenkins was, and I went to a large meeting of collectors, of the West Coast Civil War collectors. We were meeting in this lovely 1795 reconstructed cabin in this man's backyard, sitting at this huge table next to a walk-in fireplace, eating Kentucky Fried Chicken and talking about how cool we were as collectors. When I brought up the mention that, hey, you know, I have this collection of this man who is the only man from Los Angeles to go back and fight in the Civil War, and what I got was a complete, yeah, right, sure, So over these years, I've done the research and pretty much have proved that that's true, and we know this now. Along the way, I did meet the members of the Cal 100 at Fort Tejon, and of course, I had to join up with them. That's how I ended up being a reenactor, was because of this collection. And over the years, let's see, this collection was bought in '96, and from Louis, when did you write your article for that?
10 years ago, 2006.
2006, okay, so for the 10 years, I was kind of the Lone Ranger, touting this man. As I said, I did a tour in uniform of various roundtables in the West Coast Civil War Roundtable Conference, where I was Charles Jenkins at the 1912 Grand Army encampment, welcoming everyone to it, and then telling my personal story of what happened to me when I became a prisoner and all of those sorts of things. Some of the important things that I love the title for Lewis's biography when he finally wrote it, A Sketch of the Extraordinary Life of an Ordinary Man. I had always said that Jenkins was a Forrest Gump-like character. He was sort of a nobody that got himself in the middle of very big things all the time. No matter where he went, he was just in the middle of it. And I always enjoyed that. But for years, I displayed this collection. Part of it has been in a display at the Autry. Of course, the Lincoln Shrine, the drum barracks, a couple other minor exhibitions here and there, but I've taken it around. And I've tried to preach the importance of who this man was to Los Angeles, completely forgotten after he died. And the other part that I tried to research was, where did it all come from? You know, how did it end up in a store in Salt? Well, I had a man do some research on that, and he says he's not sure exactly where, but there's a Santa Monica connection to it. And we never knew what that Santa Monica connection was. So even years after Lewis wrote his article, I'm still trying to figure some of this stuff out. And I go to a historical arms show in Santa Barbara now. And I'm looking at some items on a table, and this one fellow that sold mostly Japanese swords and things had a collection of Civil War items in Riker boxes. That's the little boxes on the end there, they're cardboard with glass top. And he didn't know much about Civil War items, so he takes these items to Earl Robinson, who I'm hanging around with, to get as much of his knowledge as I can on collecting. And he asked Earl to price them for him. So Earl sits there and prices these things so this man can sell them. He takes them back to his table. Later on, as I'm making my rounds of this gun show, I walk up to this man's table and I'm looking at these boxes, and I see one's full of a bunch of Massachusetts items. And those Massachusetts items are mostly 1850s Shako brass from militia helmets and things like that. So I thought, well, that wouldn't have anything to do with him. Looked at a few button boxes, nothing there. Put everything down and turned to walk away. And as I'm walking away, my mind says to me, Charles Myers Jenkins, Andersonville, Millen, Savannah. And I stopped in my tracks and I thought, where did that come from? So I went back over to the box, I picked up the box, I looked at it again, shook it around, tried to see what all was in there. Nothing. I turned to walk away, it happens again. Charles Myers Jenkins, Andersonville, Millen, Savannah. So I went back a third time, and I said to the guy, can I open up that box and look inside? He said, sure. And it wasn't until we pulled the pins out and I picked up the lid that I noticed in the tape around the outside of the box, it was a much bigger box. Charles Myers Jenkins, Andersonville, Libby, Millen. And on it, it says cufflinks, lapel pin, and 58 caliber. Charles was cavalry. 58 caliber doesn't make any sense to me for a man who was in the cavalry. And that's more of an infantry round, but it wasn't in there. There was no bullet, there was no 58 caliber or anything. But there was a set of cufflinks, and there was also something that about made the hair stand up on the back of my neck, which I didn't bring it with me because it's so tiny you wouldn't be able to see it anyway. But it's the original Grand Army of the Republic badge. It's called the 3BN. Not many people know what it is. Super rare, very, very costly if you can find one. And for years I had looked for one of these, refusing to pay the retail price, sure that someday I would find it in somebody's old jewelry box or something laying there, because they're only about 7/8 of an inch by 7/8 of an inch, very tiny gold piece. And like I said, I've looked for them for many, many years. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I would find Charles's 3BN badge. As a matter of fact, I would never even thought there was a GR post in Los Angeles that early. This badge would have been between 1866 and 1869. They would have worn this because in 1869, they went to the more Medal of Honor style of Grand Army badge for the GAR. So this is the type 1 badge, this is the type 3 badge that you see on most of the photographs of Grand Army men. So here it is, almost 15 years after I first came across this collection and tried to tell everybody about who Mr. Jenkins was and his importance to LA, I bumped into another piece of the collection that I must have broken off at some time. And then it's only a few years later when I hear that a diary's been found. And this is where I meet Paul. Lewis was the one who told me about the diary. And it's kind of what I've been waiting for the longest time, because we didn't have a lot of quotes straight from the horse's mouth. There are a few books where there are quotes straight from Jenkins' mouth. And as Louis said earlier, the pension papers, you really got to take them with a grain of salt, because these are guys are out to get money from the government. And they have to show how beat up they were and how bad everything was in order to get it. So they're a little over the top in explaining how sick they were or how badly they were wounded or whatever in those papers. And then the diary comes out and we start reading this diary, and it sounds like he's having a grand old time after he got out of prison. The pension papers mention him, barely alive, sores all over his body, and here he is chasing these women out up and down the East Coast once he's out. So kind of hard to tell exactly what it was like when he left Andersonville, but Andersonville is no walk. I brought a couple Harper's Weekly here with original pictures of Andersonville survivors, so you can take a look at the condition of these men once they got out of there. And I've always said that if they had T-shirts in the 1860s, Charles would have had one that said Southern Prisons Tour, 1863 to 1864, because he was in Libby, he was in Andersonville, Savannah, Millen before he got out. And one last word also about parole, when he mentioned the being sent to Camp Parole. During the Civil War, the exchange of prisoners had been stopped. And that's why he languished so long in these prisoner of war camps, because they were no longer exchanging prisoners as they did at the beginning of the war. The South had refused to exchange African-American prisoners. The North took umbrage to it, so they stopped exchanging all prisoners. So what you could get if you were lucky, and Charles was, and some of the more ill people were, was you got paroled. And what parole meant was you can get out of prison and you can go back to a camp on the Union side or the Confederate side, but you're not eligible to fight. You're not eligible to fight again until you're officially exchanged. So you had to be kind of on your honor. Now, whether Jenkins was officially exchanged when he returned to the unit or not, I don't know. It's hard to say. He had to square up with the Reds, obviously, and maybe he didn't even care if he got caught again and would maybe be executed for something like that. But it does amaze me that he was able to get out of prison, go through camp parole in such a short amount of time, and then return to his unit for some of the hardest campaigning there was to be. He returned to the unit when they were with Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley. Now, Sheridan burnt the Shenandoah Valley to the ground at this period, and they went from the top to the bottom. And when they were done with that, they turned and they came all the way across Virginia, smashing, burning, and fighting through torrential rains the whole way, all the way back to White Horse Landing, just outside of Pittsburgh. Jenkins was with them for all of this. How a man could stand all of that, I have no idea. And then to be part of the final push all the way to Appomattox, and after getting out of Andersonville prison, to be able to stand there and see the Confederates come forth with a surrender flag, to meet Custer, to see Custer come into your camp covered in battle flags that he caught that day, he mentions in that diary. It's just an absolutely amazing story. And as Lewis has told you, he came back to LA. He was quite the well-known character. He was a very combative Zenyeto, but he was very responsible for improving the entire system. He got all the dead cows and dogs and everything out of the open ditch Zenyeto. And by the time of the end of his tenure, we were going to underground piping at that point. And that's the mention that you mentioned from Catherine Mulholland, talking about him threatening the one guy with the knife on horseback and cut his heart out if he gets out of that ditch. which the guy very smartly did now. But she also called him one of the last of the lawless Anglos living in Los Angeles at that time. But a very interesting character. Of course, he went on to become the Deputy U.S. Marshal, helped to break up some of the Union train problems that they had in the, what was it, 1890, the Pullman strike. He was a part of that Pullman strike, so very interesting. But once the diary was found, Paul gave me the name Gagliano, and that seemed to be the last name I needed to put all this together. Once I traced Gagliano's name back, I went all the way back to when Charles died. I happened to have some of his papers from the courthouse at the down in Los Angeles, and in those papers there is a letter of contention where the family is complaining about this woman, Juanita Oliveira, claiming that she's the heir to Jenkins' estate. Well, eventually they quit that claim. Juanita Oliveira, his housekeeper, gets all of his stuff, which includes some property, a very nice piece of Santa Monica, which is right now covered with apartment buildings and movie studios and things, so I can't imagine what that might have been worth. He owned 500 shares of movie stock. And then it mentioned some bric-a-brac, some of this sort of thing that he owned. She ended up with all of that, died 3 years later. Her sister, Tadea Oliveira, inherited what was hers. She married a man by the name of Gagliano, and Clement was the son. So now we know how all of his stuff ended up going from 1158 Santee Street all the way to Solvang. And I'm still not sure about that Santa Monica connection, but the more I checked into it, that's where Mr. Gagliano lived. He lived in Santa Monica. So I'm guessing that he sold part of it to an antique store there first, where someone told me they thought that's where they saw it. Anyway, that's the story of the collection here, and afterwards, if you like, I'd be glad to explain any of these to you. So when we're done here, if we come up front and you have questions on any of the items, I'll be glad to tell you about. Go ahead.
Between everybody talking about Mr. Jenkins now, you knew him so well. I'm thinking about any evidence of what today we call PTSD. After going through all that, did he talk about nightmares? Did he talk about flashbacks? Did he talk about...
Over at the end here, I have a photograph of what Los Angeles looked like in the 40s. You see a lot of 10-story buildings, and I've got an arrow that points to his home. If you look closely at it, you'll see what looks like somebody's taken a boxcar and set it on top of the back porch. Well, that's actually a sleeping porch that he built out there because he could not sleep indoors. After sleeping in Andersonville with no tent, laying in the mud for 15 months outside, he mentions he cannot sleep indoors. At least his wife mentioned in the pension papers, which again, you've got to take with a grain of salt, that he could not sleep indoors, and that's why he had that porch built out in the back of his house.
It's a fascinating story of how everything came together and collected or connected. Is this stuff displayed? Is this stuff regularly displayed at the Drew Museum, or? No,
it's just part of my collection. I have a lot of other California type items and things that have to do with the second mass category.
You just keep it in a secure place?
I keep it in a secure place.
So the big question that I'm coming to is, you're young like I'm young, but we're going to go on someday. Has one of your children taken an interest in this stuff?
I have no children.
Uh-oh.
No, but we're accepting bidders. Okay. I think we need to get on with our next speaker. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, a lot of us who do history, whatever form it is, this is how these things sometimes happen. These weird coincidences start to come together. You talk about something in your head. I just had a guy I'm working with who's doing genealogy. Same thing. He just shows up in places and things happen. And he doesn't know why, but yeah, it happens. You mentioned Waldo Fay, the photograph of him with his horse. That's mentioned in the diary too, where Jenkins says, I received Waldo Fay's photograph today. So it's really neat to have those two things. And other items like that. We're going to switch gears and talk about the brother, William W. And I don't know if I should stand on this side of the room or this side of the room, because we have the descendants here of William W. But William was the older brother, 4 years older. And as Lewis mentioned, I think briefly, William also did had some very interesting things happen to him in his life. And I want to talk about two of those and then turn it over to Alan to talk about another aspect of that. So let me move on to the next slide here. William had something of a law enforcement career. It was an interesting one. When he was about 21, he was called by a justice of the peace in Los Angeles on a civil matter. A man named Antonio Ruiz had a $50 debt that needed to be dealt with. So the justice of the peace gave a writ of attachment to a deputized constable, which means, hey, you, I'm making you a constable. Now, I think Jenkins probably was somehow connected with either the justice of the peace or the court system. But he sent out on this errand to take something from Ruiz's house of the value of $50 and bring it to the court to satisfy the judgment. So Jenkins is, again, he's 21, William. And he goes to this house of Antonio Ruiz and he walks in. And this is where the documentation gets to be a little sketchy. And I'm going to be very brief in this. But he sees a guitar. And he goes in and he takes the guitar and he starts to walk out. And he's accosted by the common law wife of Senor Ruiz, a woman named Maria Candelaria Poirena. And she tells Antonio Ruiz, go bring him back in the house, we need that guitar back. And so that happens, and Jenkins is brought back in, and they're in the room of this adobe house. And evidently, Maria Candelaria said to Jenkins, it's not clear whether Ruiz and Poirena spoke English at all, or how much Spanish Jenkins might have known. I think he knew some. He'd been in town for several years by then. But she said she had a letter in the guitar. Now, it's an interesting thing about why would you keep a letter in a guitar? But people do interesting things with stuff that they value, whether it's putting it in a book or under a mattress, whatever it is. Jenkins evidently says no and starts to leave. And Maria Candelaria grabs the guitar, and Antonio Ruiz is standing behind William and grabs him from behind like this. So William has one hand free. He pulls out a Derringer or small pistol, and he reaches over his shoulder and he fires. The bullet penetrates the chest of Antonio Ruiz, and he is mortally wounded. He dies the next day. So, what do you do then? And a little context here, Los Angeles in the 1850s was not necessarily the city of angels. There were a lot of things going on. The Mexican-American War had concluded less than 10 years before this. Some historians argue the war didn't really end, that it continued. Now, you could debate what that means, but I think what is clear is that tensions were high for a lot of reasons. The gold rush comes along right after the war, and then you start seeing a lot of immigration to California. There's a southern route through Los Angeles. A lot of people are coming through. Most of them are young, single men. And I'm reading a couple books that talk about this period quite a bit. So it's basically guns, alcohol, and testosterone. That's what you're dealing with. The new Colt revolver just come out, which revolutionized killing, right? Alcohol's flowing everywhere in America in the mid-19th century, and especially here, where there were a certain number of churches and X many times of saloons and taverns. And you've got these young men without a social network to keep them in check, whether it's mom or sisters or wives for that matter. And so this is the era that's going on. And then you've got the ethnic factor too, where you've got Spanish-speaking Californians and Mexicans who this had been their homeland just a short time before. You have a lot of Americans, many of them from the South, who have a certain code of honor about how they deal with things. There's a lot going on here in this situation. So William is arrested, and then he is released on his own recognizance without bail, which inflames some people's thinking. Why is that happening? Is he being given favoritism in this? And the answer probably is, to a degree, yes. Usually you have something of bail to guarantee appearance. And then some community members start to gather. And so if you know where Fort Moore Hill is, it's above Olvera Street and the plaza. There were several hills up there. Folks start to gather up there, mostly Spanish speakers and a few Frenchmen. And the reason why that makes sense is because the French and the Mexicans and Californians had common connections, religion being one of them. And their languages were fairly similar. There were intermarriages and godparents and that sort of thing. So the ringleader of this group on the hill was a man named Fernando Gadeaga, who was actually French-born. And there are threats about storming the town. And Jenkins was rearrested and confined in jail, by the way. So he was actually in jail at the time where this was starting to become a big deal. The jail was basically on the west side of Spring Street at that point. So it's also a dark town. At night, there's not a lot going on in terms of visibility. And so you can imagine what's going on as people are starting to panic about, will there be violence, what's going to happen, who's that sort of thing. So the city marshal, for example, had gathered people together at the bottom of the hill, which is not the place to be in a defensive position, right? People at the top of the hill probably have a better spot there. They were drinking a lot too, evidently, so go figure out. But the marshal sends some guys up to try to do a little reconnaissance. Some gunfire rings out. The marshal is shot and wounded, and there's just a lot going on. Community meetings are held, and it's usually the people at the upper levels of society who are going to be the ones who are going to form these committees. Now, you may know, this is 1856. Some of you may know there was a big vigilance committee in San Francisco that year. And there had been one 5 years before that. And this is the era, still, probably the peak in America, of citizens deciding to take the law into their own hands. We have a lot of debate now about concealed carry and what we can do to protect ourselves. Well, that was the standard at the time, was a lot of people thought, oh, forget the law. Who are the policemen? Elected officials who don't have any training. The courts are not efficient. So there's a lot of that going on. But the prominent citizens in town decide they're going to have a public meeting, organize a defense of the community. It almost seemed like martial law was being imposed. Now, martial law is a military thing, and there was a captain in the Army, EOC Ord, if you know about Fort Ord. That's what this is named for. Ord was also known for doing the first survey of Los Angeles in 1849. And this is 7 years later, and he's coming out to scout out locations for military installations. And Ord comes up from San Pedro into Los Angeles just at the time this whole era is going on, the tension and all that. And Ord wrote in his, I think it was his diary, it was published later on, that he observed what was going on, and he said there was more ado than violence or something like that. He just basically said, yeah, there's stuff going on, I got better things to do, and I'm gonna head out to San Bernardino to do my thing. Pardon me, the district court judge, Benjamin Hayes, wrote about this, and he actually wrote a manuscript by hand that's at the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley, called The Great Riot of 1856. And it's kind of a mocking thing, and he's doing this years later. I don't know exactly when it was, and sometimes when you write your narrative later on, you kind of recreate it the way you want it to be, because in 1856, he seems to have been a little bit panicky too about what was going on. He took affidavits from Americans who were concerned about these swarthy Mexicans and Frenchmen in the hill, what they may or may not do. But later on, Hayes said that this was basically just a kind of a farce. People were panicking, and they were really having more of a mental problem with this than a real problem. So how much of an outrage, how much of a near riot there would have been is questionable. At the time, I think people thought this was an example of a race war about to erupt. The Southern California Courtland, I've forgotten exactly when, had a really interesting article, Pandemonium in the Plaza, I think it was called, about this. If you want to know more, look for that. What happened, though, was William was tried for the homicide of Antonio Reese. And the key thing, and by the way, the judge was Hayes. When Hayes gave his instructions to the jury, he said, there has to be an absolute fear of your life to justify an officer using violence in a civil manner. And the question becomes, what is in fear for your life? How are you going to have a judgment or determination of that? Jenkins was grabbed from behind by somebody who had his arms around him, and somebody else is grabbing the guitar at the same time. In a split second, he pulls his gun out and fires over his shoulder. So the charge was actually manslaughter because there was no real premeditation that you could probably get a conviction on if you were the DA at the time. And Hayes' instructions were very lengthy and very clear. It's very abundant that he thought that Jenkins had committed a crime and needed to pay for it. The jury went out and deliberated for all of 15 minutes, returned, and acquitted him. Now, when I say all of 15 minutes, that's probably pretty standard. I've looked at 1,200 court cases from that time period in Los Angeles, and trials were almost always one day, which meant the jury's going to deliberate for 15 minutes or 25 minutes or half an hour. They just made quick decisions, and I'm not saying that's good, bad, or indifferent. We complain now about court cases that go on for 12 years, right? And juries spend weeks and weeks deliberating. It's a different era and different evidence standards and stuff like that, but William was acquitted. Then Fernando Carriaga, the ringleader of the mob on the Hill, went to trial for incitement of riot, and he too was acquitted. And so there were some whisperings that maybe it was kind of a quid pro quo. Well, if Jenkins gets off, then maybe this guy gets off and we're all happy. Things will work out just fine. There is material about this in the two main newspapers, well, the only papers, I guess, in 1856. The LA Star on the left, which you can't see very well because it's small type, and also the El Clamor Público, which was published by a young man very out of his teens named Ramirez, and their views are very different. Ramirez talks about Assassinato de Don Antonio Ruiz, the assassination of. Whereas the Star says a man is killed. That's a homicide. So you get a very different perspective based on ethnicity, and I think some degree personality. Ramirez was a very active publisher of information, and he had very strong opinions. Not that people read his paper very often. I think the intended audience were not really reading this paper. Mostly French supporters of his probably were the supporters of that paper. But in any case, that's William W.'s probably most notorious incident. He did go on to run for marshal in the next election in Los Angeles, which I thought was interesting. And he did not win that election. But in 1857, the marshal who was involved in this, William Getman, who had been wounded, he ran both for marshal and Los Angeles County Sheriff, and he won both, and he got to keep both positions. So again, it's a different era. A lot of things are going on that you just wouldn't have now, like judges holding up guns in court and yelling at people and gunfire breaking out and all that kind of stuff. But Getman is existing marshal, becomes the sheriff. He's only in office about a couple of weeks in 1858 when a madman holds himself up in a house and Getman goes to confront him. And Getman was like, some of these law enforcement officers were very courageous, but headstrong and foolish at the same time. He just literally walked up to the guy and said, "Why don't you hand me that gun?" Didn't assess the situation, trying to figure out what's going on. And the guy says, "Okay, give him a bullet." And shot and killed the marshal. Well, William W. Jenkins had actually gone up on the roof of the building above that and threw a hole in it, because this is LA, small little town, they don't keep things in good repair. He reaches down with his gun and starts to fire, and a couple other guys who were with the marshal did the same thing and killed this guy named Reed, who was a madman. So William W. didn't shy away from being involved in these kinds of things. He was a constable in other positions later on in Los Angeles County. And then I'll let Alan talk more about his years up here in the Santa Clarita Valley area, but I want to mention one more thing. Two more things, actually. So yeah, Jenkins was a constable at San Gabriel, the old mission town. He was actually an expert in mining. He wrote papers about mining history and things that were going on in Southern California especially. I mentioned that he and his brother owned this former soap factory on Rancho San Antonio. And then he became associated with the families who live where I work, over in the city of industry today. This is the Workman and Temple families. William W. became the estate administrator for FPF Temple, who was a prominent member of Los Angeles society, owned one of the two commercial banks in town. The bank went belly up in 1876, and the whole estate went down in flames, but William W. managed to get himself appointed administrator after FPF Temple died in 1880. Things didn't go very well between Jenkins and the Temple family. I think it's both sides. We can all imagine what happens in these estate issues. There's a lot of room for tension and fighting and all that. One of the amazing things is that this deed box survives, Mr. Temple's. It's in the family. Your mom still has it. This is a photo from 22 years ago. That's how long I've been there, of that deed box. But what came out of this estate thing is a very interesting little detail that I'll try to keep very short so I can give Alan plenty of time. Alcatraz Island was granted at the very end of the Mexican era by Governor Pio Pico to William Workman, who owns our ranch site. June 1846. A month later, the American forces took Monterey, and that was the cutoff date. The Americans would recognize any land transfers. It's July 7th. This is about June 8th. When Pico gives William Workman what was often called Bird Island, also Alcatraz. The reason was because, and it's in the actual original deed, which has been lost, I'll tell you that sort of just briefly in a moment. The reason was because Pico thought there'd be value to have a lighthouse on Alcatraz for ships coming into San Francisco Bay, known as Yerba Buena in those days. So William Workman gets this little island and then promptly turns it over to his son-in-law, the FPF Temple I just mentioned. When the American Congress decided that they needed to have a commission hear land claims that had been given under Spain and Mexico, the Land Claims Act of 1851 is instituted. And if you had a grant under Spain or Mexico, you were supposed to present it, evidence, maps, the original deeds, witnesses to this commission that met mostly in San Francisco and very briefly in Los Angeles. Temple did not do that. He did not make a claim. In 1856, though, he reads an article in a San Francisco newspaper that says that John Charles Fremont, who was pretty famous in his day, was making a claim for the island. Well, what had happened was when Fremont was participating in the conquest of California, he approached Temple when Fremont was in LA for a while and said, hey, the government would like to buy that island from you for $5,000. I will give you an IOU. Now, John Fremont is telling you, I'm going to give you an IOU. It's kind of like reading Horace Bell's book. You do not want to take an IOU from John Fremont because he made decisions on his own without consulting anybody. But Temple took it and then was waiting for his money and nothing ever happened. And then here is 1856 and Fremont's trying to make a claim for Alcatraz. And then Temple is stirred into action and starts to make a claim on the island. It didn't go anywhere fundamentally because of two reasons. One, Fremont was court-martialed. And of the, I think, 9 or 10 or 11 reasons why he was court-martialed, one was trying to buy Alcatraz Island on behalf of the government without authority to do so. Second thing that what happened was that President Fillmore declared Alcatraz a military possession. And that's why it's still a federal possession today. It was a military installation. You mentioned Henry Hamilton being jailed. He was sent to Alcatraz Island in 1864 to cool his heels for a while, along with other Angelinos. So there was really no claim there. But Temple persisted, and then after he died, he had children who tried to do this. One was a son named John H. Temple, and he and William W. were friends. And so the two of them decided in the late 1800s that they were really going to pursue a claim in Alcatraz. Get all the original documents together, find an attorney, go to DC, and make a presentation and try and get money out of this. And you can imagine the wheels in their head. You see, it's 40 years later, $5,000 at interest over 40 years is $9 million, whatever it is. They were super excited about this. And so he hired this attorney. The guy goes to Washington, D.C., and comes back with some things that aren't there anymore. The original deed is gone. The original map is gone. So, Wayne, maybe you can use your powers of collecting, and maybe you'll hear a voice in your head saying, Alcatraz Island, William W. Jenkins, brother of Charles, to find these things. They vanished. And William W. and John H. Temple tried legal matters to get this attorney to turn over the stuff that they thought he had stolen. It was a real nightmare. What eventually happened was, with the claim, nothing, it died out. Jenkins maintained what surviving papers, left them to his daughters, Olive and Ruby, right? June and Ruby, thank you. And they donated them to the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley. I had the opportunity to go look at those a number of years ago and check that stuff out. And then did a paper for the 150th anniversary of the Alcatraz grant back in 1996, the same year you found stuff. So just a little interesting detail about one of the brothers and his involvement in some affairs in Los Angeles. But now I want to finish up by having Alan talk about the amazing range war of Castaic.
I'm Alan Pollack. I'm president of the Santa Clarita Valley Historical Society. And one of the things I've always said about Santa Clarita, if you drive through Santa Clarita now, it's a basic, bedroom suburban community with its strip malls and cookie cutter homes and all that. But hidden in all that, in all that suburban community, is a history. If you look at the history of Newhall and Saugus and Castaic, this was the Wild West. And this story is really one of the quintessential stories of how this was the Wild West. So we're going to talk about, again, Charles Jenkins' brother, William Wirt Jenkins, and his involvement in, and I'm actually going to show you a couple of things that Paul just mentioned about William, and I'll just kind of gloss over in less detail, but let's get started. So William Wirt Jenkins was a pioneer of the Santa Clarita Valley, and as you've heard, he led a rather notorious and colorful life which was straight out of the pages of the Wild West. He grew up in Ohio with his brother, and he arrived in California goldfields with his family in 1851. There on the American River, Jenkins became skillful with a pistol when he had to hold off claim jumpers to cite claims that they were working on. So 2 years later, Jenkins drifts to the rough and tumble Pueblo of Los Angeles, and you've heard that this was not the city of the angels in the 1850s. It was one of the most violent towns in America at that time. And it was a place seething with racial hatred and mistrust between the native Californians and the Anglo immigrants, as Paul mentioned. Shortly thereafter, Jenkins' prowess with a pistol would gain the attention of Mayor Ignacio del Valle, and Jenkins was recruited into a semi-vigilante force called the Los Angeles Rangers. And this force was commissioned with cleaning up the mean streets of Los Angeles. A couple of the fellow rangers of Jenkins was Major Horace Bell, who was mentioned previously. He had been a newspaper man and who later recounted his escapades in the book mentioned Reminiscences of a Ranger, which, by the way, was really the first book published in Los Angeles. Correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah. And then his other compatriot in the Los Angeles Rangers was Cyrus Lyon, who with his brother Sanford emigrated out to California in the early 1850s from Macias, Maine, and eventually the two of them settled here in the Santa Clarita Valley and set up a stagecoach stop named Lyon Station, which we believe was in the vicinity of the Eternal Valley Cemetery up on Sierra Highway. And as you may know, Lyons Avenue is named after them. So this ragtag group of gunfighters embarked on a shoot first, ask questions later campaign, and they were said to have effectively cleaned up the mean streets of Los Angeles within about 2 years. Paul told you about the incident with Antonio Ruiz with the guitar, so I'll just briefly show you that. This is not an actual picture of Antonio Ruiz, it's just a picture I found to sort of represent the guitar. This, again, there was after Jenkins shot Ruiz, they had the trial, and there was almost a mob of some of the native Californians that wanted to lynch him, and he was eventually acquitted. Jenkins eventually migrates up to the Rancho San Francisco, which is the Santa Clarita Valley, and at that time the fledgling oil business was just taking off in adjacent Pico Canyon. Along with Sanford Lyon and Henry Clay Wiley, the man over here, they sunk the first oil well in Pico Canyon in 1869 using the spring pole method of drilling. As a constable in 1873, Jenkins was reported to have escorted Tiburcio Vasquez gang member Abdon Leyva to turn him in at Lyon Station to Los Angeles authorities. Leyva had actually given himself up after finding the famous outlaw Vasquez in bed with his wife at a hideout near Lake Elizabeth. Vasquez was known for his lady-killing charm. And actually, Abdon Leyva, when Vasquez was eventually captured, he actually testified against him in court, in trial. So in 1872, Jenkins made the fateful decision to lay claim to a large section of land along Castaic Creek, upon which he built the Lazy Z Ranch 6 years later. He married Olive Rhodes of Illinois, and he had 2 daughters. In the ensuing years, the Lazy Z Ranch became well known for breeding and training top-flight racehorses. Jenkins even trained horses for Lucky Baldwin of Santa Anita racetrack fame. And he also took horses belonging to Francis Pliny F. Temple, who was nicknamed El Templito of the Temple and Workman Bank. He developed a lifelong friendship with Baldwin, and Paul mentioned the inheritance issues that he had with Temple. In 1893, Jenkins was involved with the Alcatraz Island, as was mentioned. And actually, Horace Bell in his newspaper, The Porcupine, had referred to Jenkins as the Baron of Alcatraz. Just to show you the men that were involved with the whole claim issue with Alcatraz, we had, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, Governor Pio Pico granted to William Workman around 1850, that's Workman, and Workman eventually ceded ownership to Francis Temple, and Temple gave 1/2 interest to John Downey, who gave a 1/4 interest to Jenkins. And Jenkins became a joint owner of the island at that time with Downey, who quit claiming the land to Jenkins upon his death, and then there was a whole other thing that went on with that. Paul mentioned the situation muddied by John C. Fremont. And now we're going to talk about the Castaic Range War. So all was well at the Lazy Z Ranch until William C. Cormickle showed up in 1890. Cormickle was a crusty 50-year-old gentleman with a proclivity for guns similar to that of Jenkins. And he purchased 1,600 acres of land in the Castaic area, which had already been claimed by Jenkins for the Lazy Z Ranch. Cormickle himself had a large ranch out in Santa Paula, And that's where he spent most of his time. And he had his wife and several of his sons running the operations in Castaic. Now, the root of the dispute between Jenkins and Cornmickle actually lay in an ambiguity in the law, which resulted in overlapping land grants in the Castaic area, which were given to two railroad companies. These Castaic lands were part of the body of more than 1 million acres in Ventura and Los Angeles counties, which were granted both the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad and the Southern Pacific Railroad. The lands were originally granted to the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad by an act of Congress in 1866. And in 1871, the same general area was granted to the Southern Pacific Railroad, but it was supposed to specifically exclude the lands previously granted to the Atlantic and Pacific. But there was one problem. The Atlantic and Pacific Railroad was never completed. Thus, in July 1866, the land granted to the defunct Atlantic and Pacific Railroad was, by an act of Congress, forfeited. It reverted to the United States government and was restored to the public domain, which allowed it to be homesteaded. But in spite of the previous exclusions in 1871, the Southern Pacific Company continued to claim the lands that had reverted to the government. And it was in this setting that Cornmickle appeared on the scene in 1890. Jenkins, unfortunate for him, had settled on land which ended up in the dispute between the government and the Southern Pacific Railroad. Cornmickle claimed that same land based on what he called a permit from the Southern Pacific. So with Jenkins and Cornmickle claiming the same land, the Castaic Range War, as we know it, officially began on February 28, 1890, when two men allied with Jenkins were shot dead by Cornmickle and an accomplice as they were hauling lumber onto the disputed land to erect a cabin. 3 days earlier, a 25-year-old man by the name of George Walton had hauled some lumber to a section of land on which he was trying to file for a homestead. But that same section of land was claimed by Cornmickle. So Walton passed by a shanty occupied by Cornmickle, and Cornmickle took exception to Walton's actions, and he had the lumber moved and thrown over a fence below the shanty. Walton and Cornmickle proceeded to have an altercation, during which Walton struck Cornmickle in the face. So then Walton decides to move the lumber back to his homestead location with the assistance of two Jenkins allies, Dolores Cook, seen here, and his brother-in-law, Jose Olme, seen here. And I just put a dog scene there. This picture is a home of the Cordova family, which is a longtime pioneer family in the Castaic area. The photograph is about 1886, and this shows the two men that were involved with this Range War incident. Cook, as a matter of fact, was a Fernandino Indian of Tataviam, Kitanamuck, and Tonga descent, and Castaic was his ancestral territory. So back to the incident. They loaded a wagon with the lumber. They started off with Walton's wagon in the lead. Now, just as a disclaimer, these are not original pictures from the incident. We don't have that, so we just put up just to represent, to kind of give you a flavor for it. Olme accompanied Walton on the wagon, with Cook driving a horse and buggy behind them. And as the wagon passed by the shanty, Cornmickle and his accomplice William A. Gardner appeared at the windows and opened fire with rifles and pistols. Walton was instantly killed, and Cook would go back to Jenkins' house but die from his gunshot wounds 3 hours later. Olme was the only lucky one. He grabbed and ran alongside a horse. He shielded himself from the gunshots as he passed by the shanty, and he escaped to Jenkins' house unscathed, the only survivor of the shooting. And as soon as they were finished shooting, Cornmickle and Gardner raced out of the shanty to a nearby canyon and fled into the canyon. About 1 week later, Sheriff W.H. Riley of Ventura County received word of where the men were and that they were ready to give themselves up. So Riley met up with the fugitives in Piru Canyon, and he brought them to Ventura. In late March 1890, Cornmickle and Gardner stood trial for the murder of Walton and Cook. Their defense lawyers claimed the defendants were justified in the killing, alleging that Walton and Cook were the aggressors, and that Cormickle had to kill them in defense of his own property. The defense further attempted to show a conspiracy on the part of the men who lost their lives and Jenkins to kill Cormickle and Gardner. So they had an 18-day trial. It was one of the longest in county history to that time. As Paul mentioned, most trials lasted 1 day, so this was like an eternity for trials at that time. But the jury did just take 20 minutes to make a decision. And that decision was, both Cormickle and Gardner were found not guilty of the murder of Dolores Cook. And a second case for the murder of George Walton was also dismissed the next day. Now, I have spoken with descendants of Dolores Cook who are still here in the valley, and they still believe justice had been denied in this case. Well, the trial was over, but the Jenkins-Cormickle feud was just beginning. For the next 25 years, Jenkins, Cormickle, and their henchmen picked up guns over every issue in the Castaic area involving roads, mining, grazing, and water. And we believe that up to 20 or 21 people were said to have lost their lives over this period of time in the feud at Range War. The feud was thought to have ended in October 1904 when Cormickle was finally awarded the contested land. And a patent issued by the United States Land Office awarded Cormickle the 1,600 acres that had been claimed previously by Jenkins. The Los Angeles Times quoted attorney J.L. Murphy. The case has cost far more than the land was worth, but it was a fight for principle with the settlers that could not be given up once undertaken. And the violence continued despite of the settlement. It was so bad that at one point President Theodore Roosevelt felt compelled to send newly appointed U.S. Forest Ranger Robert Emmett Clark to Castaic to attempt to intimidate the foreign factions to stop the fighting. And this did quiet things down, but Clark left in 1913, and again, after that, the war resumed. In fact, shortly after Clark left, Jenkins was shot in the chest at his ranch house by a Cormickle partisan, but he didn't survive that attack. And things came to a head on March 8, 1913, when Cormickle ally William Lewis Billy Rhodes shot Jenkins in a pistol duel in Castaic Canyon. As with the Cormickles, Jenkins had a running feud with the Rose family over disputed land. Rose had accused Jenkins of offering large sums of money to have him killed. And Jenkins said Rose never had any right to the land that he claimed, based on a grazing permit. And for this incident, Rose was brought to court on a charge of assault with intent to commit murder. This is a quote from Jenkins about when he testified in court, which was kind of interesting. He says, "I tried to get out my gun, but the pesky thing worked slow. I fired 2 shots and think I would have got Rose, but just then came another bullet which cut my arm." Now, ironically, neither of the 2 principals of the Castaic Range War were killed in the battles. Both died of natural causes. Jenkins, and you can see his death certificate here, died quietly at age 81 on October 19, 1916 from a cerebral embolism. We previously thought that Cormickle was shot to death in 1916, an act for which Jenkins was suspended. It turns out that a recent review of his death certificate shows that he actually died from chronic kidney disease on March 25, 1919. And he's buried at Forest Lawn Cemetery in Glendale. And finally, and ironically, neither Jenkins nor Cormickle died with their boots on. And that's all I got to say.
You guys endured a marathon session. To try to break up into 4 parts to make it easier for you. Questions about anything we talked about? For any of the speakers? Nothing? Yeah.
Why was Los Angeles a secessionist stronghold?
Well, I think a lot of it is because of the types of people who lived here. It's Southern California, so as people were migrating out from the gold rush onwards. A large proportion are Southerners. Many of them identified with the rancho culture as being somewhat similar to the plantation culture the southern states. So they allied themselves with prominent Californios who wanted to becoming Democrats. And so there was a lot of that there, definitely. And I'm reading 2 books about this right now, Violent Land and I forget the other one, title of it, but about that era, what was going on. And the violence that was endemic in the South, which tended not to trust government, to rely on yourself, the culture of honor, and that's transplanted over here. And I think a lot of Californians identify to some degree with that idea of culture of honor too. It's, it's male privilege and those sorts of things. So I think that combination came together. It didn't really change, I think, until the boom of the 1880s when you start seeing more Midwesterners and New Englanders becoming predominant and Republicans start to take over.
Interesting. Thank you, that's interesting.
Well, I kind of picked up on, piggybacking on this one, when Dr. Pollock showed Ignacio de Valle, of course, most people from the Santa Clarita Valley know that the de Valles had the original thing, and his rancho is Rancho Camulos, and it's still in existence. He was the organizer of the California Rangers.
He was mayor at the time, Alcalde, so he was part of getting that organized.
Okay, and very prominent in the plaza, and then at some point it got so bad there in the plaza that he moved his family up to the rancho here, and in 1861. And a lot of it was this, a lot of friction between the new Angelinos and the old Californios.
Yeah.
And I also picked up on the fact that Jenkins Charles went to work at Rancho Antonio, the Lugos. The Lugos were the godparents of Isabel. Everybody knows everybody else. They're all married to each other. They're all doing things to each other. And, but it was just interesting to see the same names and stuff.
Yeah, I think that connection, sorry, Alan, between the earlier American arrivals and the Californios worked to the advantage of those Americans because they were in the minority. I think as time went on and they became more of the majority and they had more control over things, they didn't need that alignment with the Californios as much. And there were a lot of things going on too during that period of time.
And Paul had mentioned the Charles Lummis house previously, and you probably know that he was in love with one of the Del Valle girls. I forget which one it is.
It was one of the granddaughters, and he was 40-something and she was 15-something. And normally that would bother them because Senora de Valle herself, the grandmother, was 15 when she married Ignacio, who was 43. The biggest problem with Charles Lummis was that he was already married and Protestant, when that was probably more of a problem than the age difference between them.
Yeah, roving eye, as they would say in that.
But Charles Lummis was very much involved with the rancho, and you could go out and see a lot of his photographs from 1888, where he took of them and published the first thing that came out is the Home of Ramona, very much at the cutting edge of photography, because he was a photojournalist, as well as the gramophone. And I think Cyril Hauser did a thing at the Lummis house where he talks about the early photographs from that Lummis.
Lummis preserved a lot of the California music that probably wouldn't have survived.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This range war appeared very late in the history of the West. Were there other similar kinds of wars occurring at the same time, or was this one of the last ones?
This was one of the last ones. The other one that's kind of famous out here was a gunfight in Acton by 2 men, and that was in the 8th. I think it was also kind of late in the 8th. I'd have to look it up again. But yeah, this again, this was the Wild West. I mean, there were cowboys, the Indians, stagecoaches, range wars, gunfighting. It was all here. And then, interestingly enough, after the turn of the century, then this became the Hollywood Old West, because many of the early Hollywood westerns were filmed out here.
You know, one of my favorite W.W. Jenkins stories was a story about Magic Mountain. I'm sure you're familiar with that one, where he was trying to gain more land, and if you could prove the land was swamp.
Yeah, the ship thing. Yeah.
Right. If you could prove it was swamp, you could have the land, but you had to survey it by boat. Well, he eyed up that land that Magic Mountain is on right now, and as you can tell, it's not a swamp. But that wasn't gonna stop him, so what he did was he nailed wheels to a boat. And had the horse pull him around so he could sign a document that said, yes, indeed, he did survey it by boat. And somebody squealed on it, it didn't work out.
Anything else? Well, thank you all for being here.